If you own a Toyota Tundra, a Sequoia, or a Land Cruiser with the 4.7-liter V8 engine, and you have been watching a growing puddle of oil form under the front of your truck, there is a very good chance a mechanic has already told you that your lower oil pan gasket is gone, or that your front main seal has failed. The quote is probably sitting in your pocket right now, and it says somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500. I need you to put that quote down, because the catastrophic seal failure they are describing almost certainly does not exist. What is actually draining your engine is a single rubber O-ring that costs $4 and takes 30 minutes to swap, and the people who wrote you that estimate know it. To understand why this illusion works so perfectly, you need to understand what Toyota actually built when they engineered the 2UZ-Fi 4.7-liter V8 in the late 1990s. This engine was designed from the ground up for heavy-duty, high-load applications. Toyota's engineers understood that a truck pulling a boat up a mountain pass on a summer afternoon generates enormous amounts of heat inside the engine oil. Hot oil loses its viscosity, its ability to form a protective film between moving metal surfaces, and in a heavy-duty application, that degradation happens faster and more aggressively than in a passenger car. So Toyota integrated a liquid-cooled oil cooling system directly into the front of the engine block. Engine coolant from the main cooling circuit is routed through a compact oil cooler housing bolted to the front of the block, just above the oil filter. As hot oil passes through this housing on its way to the filter, the cooler coolant flowing around it pulls heat away, dropping the oil temperature before it circulates back into the engine. It is a sophisticated piece of thermal engineering, and it works beautifully for well over 100,000 miles. But it has one vulnerability, and that vulnerability is a single rubber O-ring seated in a groove where the cooler housing meets the engine block. That O-ring is responsible for sealing the pressurized oil passage between the cooler housing and the block. When the engine is running, oil is being forced through that junction at significant pressure. The O-ring compresses slightly under that pressure, and the rubber creates a perfect barrier. But rubber has a lifespan. Every time you start your engine, that O-ring heats up. Every time you shut it down, it cools. Over 10 years and 150,000 miles, those thermal cycles slowly rob the rubber of its elasticity. It flattens, it hardens. It loses the ability to compress and spring back. And the moment that seal stops conforming perfectly to the metal surfaces around it, pressurized oil finds the gap instantly. Here is where the illusion becomes almost cruel in its precision. That oil cooler housing sits high on the front face of the engine block, directly above the oil pan flange. When the O-ring fails, oil does not drip neatly from the housing itself where anyone might logically look for it. The pressure behind the leak causes oil to spray outward and then run immediately downward along the front face of the block. It coats the timing cover. It follows every contour of the cast aluminum down to the very lowest point of the engine, which is the seam where the oil pan meets the block. By the time that oil is visible from underneath the truck, it is pooling and dripping from the oil pan flange, precisely mimicking the exact appearance of a failed lower oil pan gasket. The volume of the leak amplifies the deception further. A small gap around a pressurized O-ring can pass a surprising amount of oil in a short time, which means the puddle under your truck looks like a catastrophic seal failure rather than a modest wear item. Now consider what actually fixing a lower oil pan gasket or a front main seal on this engine requires. To access the lower oil pan properly, the mechanic has to remove the front skid plate, drain the oil, and on many configurations of this truck, disconnect and lower the front differential housing and the steering rack to create enough clearance to drop the pan. That is a full day of labor at minimum, and shops know it. The front main crankshaft seal is similarly buried behind the harmonic balancer and timing components. A legitimate repair on either of those components is easily 12 to 15 billable hours, which at standard shop rates lands you comfortably at that $2,500 number. The O-ring replacement, by contrast, is a half-hour job that any person with basic mechanical ability can perform in their driveway. The gap between those two outcomes is the entire business model. The repair is straightforward. Start with a cold engine and begin by draining your coolant from the radiator drain plug, because the oil cooler housing carries coolant lines and you will need to disconnect them. Remove the oil filter completely so you have clear access to the housing. You will see the compact oil cooler unit bolted directly to the front of the block with a large central bolt, typically a 30mm fastener. Before you break that bolt loose, take note of the coolant hoses connecting to the sides of the housing and disconnect them carefully, having a rag ready for residual coolant. Now break loose the central bolt and remove it completely. The cooler housing will pull straight off the block face. Set it aside. Look at the block face where the housing was seated. You will see an O-ring groove machined into the metal, and inside that groove, you will find the original factory O-ring. On a high-mileage engine, it will not look like a round rubber seal anymore. It will look like a flat, brittle plastic ring with a hardened, cracked surface. That is your leak. That is your $2,500 diagnosis. Remove it completely using a pick or a small screwdriver, taking care not to scratch the machined groove. Clean the groove and the mating face of the cooler housing with brake cleaner and a clean rag. Any residue of the old seal or any oil contamination in that groove will prevent the new O-ring from seating correctly. Your replacement O-ring needs to match the dimensions of the original exactly. For the 2UZ FE engine, this seal is a standard size available at any Toyota dealer parts counter under the oil cooler O-ring listing or through any reputable online parts supplier, and it will cost you roughly $4. Take the new O-ring and apply a thin film of clean engine oil to the outside of it before installation. This helps it seat evenly and prevents it from rolling or pinching as you press the housing back into place. Seat the O-ring into the groove on the block face, making sure it sits fully and evenly around its entire circumference with no twists. Carefully align the cooler housing back onto the block, ensuring the O-ring does not shift during installation, and hand thread the central bolt to confirm it is not cross-threaded. Torque the bolt to specification, reconnect your coolant hoses, reinstall the oil filter, refill your coolant, and start the engine. Let it idle up to full operating temperature and watch the front of the block. Run it through a full heat cycle. You will find nothing. The puddle under your truck, the oil coating your front skid plate, the leak your mechanic called a catastrophic lower engine failure, is simply gone, permanently, for $4.30. The reason your Toyota service advisor never mentioned the O-ring is the same reason a fishing guide never tells you where to buy your own boat. The moment that $4 seal is common knowledge, a massive category of high-profit diagnostic misrepresentation disappears entirely. Toyota built a robust, repairable, long-lived engine, and the maintenance ecosystem around it quietly converted its one predictable wear item into a phantom catastrophe, specifically because the phantom pays 15 times better than the truth. Share this with every person you know who is running one of these trucks, because they are one oil puddle away from handing over $2,500 they should never spend. And if you think this is the only time the industry has done this, stay close, because the next video is going to expose the single most profitable fake fluid flush in the history of automotive service. A service so widely recommended and so completely unnecessary that the average driver has paid for it 3 times already without ever needing it